this quarterly presentation for NoCo Housing Now. For those of you who are not familiar, NoCo Housing Now is an initiative that is being managed by the Fort Collins Chamber of Commerce, but it's in cooperation with a lot of our regional partners across Larimer, Weld County, touching into Boulder as well. Really, the idea behind NoCo Housing Now is to provide a format for providing, sharing information relative to housing and looking at different strategies and programs on a quarterly basis. And so we invite you to participate to the extent that you are able to, and certainly share this information within your network. Again, if you've registered for today, you're on this call and you are now on our list for future events. So you don't have to sign up in the future. You're going to be on that list automatically. So feel free to share this information with others within your network. I'm also going to point out that we do record these sessions and we do make them available on the NoCo Housing website, which is again hosted at the Fort Collins Chamber of Commerce website. And following this meeting next week, you'll actually get a follow-up email that provides you a link to the presentation you're going to see today, as well as materials and other presentations that we've done in the past. So we're keeping a library of sorts of this information. So feel free to take advantage of that resource. And again, please feel free to share it within your network. So before we get started, I first want to thank our sponsors who are making this series available. So we have EPS Group, Northern Engineering, Brownstein, Somerset Apartments, and New Colony Apartments. And so again, thank you for our sponsors. And today we are very fortunate to have a couple of ladies who are very well versed in the development of affordable or income restricted housing. And so I'm going to first highlight Kristen Fritz, who is the Director of Real Estate for Housing Catalyst, which is formerly known as the Fort Collins Housing Authority. And then joining Kristen, we have Michelle Christensen, who is the Chief Strategy and Operations Manager for Housing Catalyst. And they're going to, again, provide some information. But as we go along, I will be monitoring for any questions that may come up from those of you that are on this call. And if you do have a question, please feel free to use the reactions button. Hopefully everyone is well versed in the usage of Zoom, but for those of you who are not, down at the bottom of your screen, you see a reactions button. So if you just click that and raise your hand whenever you have a question. Otherwise, we're going to try to keep everybody muted to cut down on any background noise. But again, feel free to, again, raise your hand at any point if you have any questions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kristen, who is the Director of Real Estate for Housing Catalyst. And so again, Kristen, feel free to provide a little bit of background on your role at the Housing Catalyst. And then we'll introduce Michelle as well. Take it away, Kristen.
All right. Thanks, Joe. Good morning, everyone. I am Kristen Fritz, and I'm actually Chief Real Estate Officer for Housing Catalyst. I've been with Housing Catalyst for just about 13 years now, really focused on the real estate development side. So as Joe mentioned, Housing Catalyst is the Fort Collins Housing Authority. We're the housing authority for the city of Fort Collins. So we changed our name a few years back, but that did not change who we are and what we do and our structure. We do have a sort of real estate development company within Housing Catalyst. And so we develop affordable housing through partnership, through ground up new development, through preservation and renovation. And I also have Michelle here with me who can talk a little bit about what she does and a big part of who we are as well related to our federal programs.
Yes, hi, my name is Michelle Christensen. I am the Chief Strategy and Operations Officer at Housing Catalyst, and I've been with Housing Catalyst for almost 19 years. In my role, I oversee the Housing Choice Voucher Program, which is our largest federal rental assistance program that we administer. I also oversee our services department as we provide services in all different factions of our operation, and I oversee the permanent supportive housing projects. So turn it back to Kristen.
Thanks, Michelle. So putting the affordable into development, I love the title of this. It makes it sound easy. We all know that it's not. My slides here today are really focused on how we do what we do, which is a very specific part of the affordable housing, helping to meet the needs of affordable housing, which is really increasing the supply of deed restricted affordable rental housing. That is what our focus is at Housing Catalyst. And there are lots of reasons why we do that, which I'll talk about, specifically kind of serving the role as a public housing authority. So in terms of real estate development, our main focus is to increase the supply of affordable housing in our community. We do that through a variety of different ways, and I'm going to focus mostly today on the actual real estate development piece, on kind of our ground up new construction, adding additional units to our community. So Housing Catalyst has quite a track record in terms of the development of affordable housing. Over the last 10 years, we have built or preserved over 800 affordable homes. And as you can see from this map, we are spread all around the community. That is intentional. And we have, over 100 units planned to be brought online in the next year or so. And also over the last 10 years, we have partnered with a lot of local nonprofits as well as private developers, and that has contributed to the addition of over 600 affordable rental units, and we have another 300 planned to be added by 2027. And partnership can look a lot of different ways for Housing Catalyst. I should say that the majority of especially the tax credit affordable housing that has come online in Fort Collins in the last 10 years has required the partnership of the local housing authority, us at Housing Catalyst. And so we really do try to partner to make sure that we are meeting that goal of just increasing the supply of affordable housing. And we do partner with local nonprofits. We also partner with other private developers. So our main tool for the development of affordable housing is the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. We are able to utilize that program for both new construction and renovation projects. Here's just kind of a highlight of some of the projects that I think a lot of people are familiar with. So you can see these projects really range in scale and type. We have done, our urban infill projects in downtown. We've also done some more of our suburban context family projects, as well as really large scale renovations. So ranging from 79 units at Oak 140 up to our largest renovation project at the Village on Shields. That was 256 units. I should say that it is nearly impossible to serve that 30 to 60% of area median income in terms of development without the use of the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. And I'll talk more about that. We also do projects that have very specific focus. So we are certainly consider ourselves both local and national experts when it comes to permanent supportive housing. We developed our first permanent supportive housing community at Redtail Ponds, and then our second is Mason Place. Those are kind of our, very specific population for people who are transitioning out of homelessness with a lot of dedicated services on site within the building. And then we also have our projects that have our community clubhouses for our families and playgrounds, and our Oak 140 project that includes very downtown living, smaller units, that type of thing. We also, do some smaller scale projects that we're able to complete without tax credits. So an example of that would be our Plum Place renovation. That's a 15-unit building that used to be public housing. We have transitioned it out of public housing, and we are now able to use grants and our own funding to do a renovation to preserve that building and keep it affordable. And because it is both small in scale and we were able to acquire it at no cost, we were able to complete that renovation without the use of tax credits. So some of these projects, just wanted to mention a couple of their details. Red Tail Ponds was completed in 2017. Mason Place was completed in 2021. All of these are designed to really serve a very special need in the community. And really, without this type of housing, the residents of these buildings would likely not have a place to live. Okay, so kind of the basics of the affordable housing world. The cost for us to build housing is the same as it is for everybody else. We, most of the time, pay market for land. We absolutely pay market for building materials. We use the same architects, general contractors that market rate multifamily use as well. The cost of lumber, the cost of everything is the same for us as it would be for anybody developing market rate multifamily. However, the difference for us is that our income is restricted. Since we are dedicated to delivering units that provide affordable rent for people at a variety of income levels, we cannot increase the income for us to be able to afford more debt, which is the traditional way a market rate multifamily developer would cover their costs. So what happens for us is the cost to build is there. We are restricted on what our operating income can be due to our affordable rents. And then we have a funding gap that is covered by a whole variety of tools, primarily the Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program, which is considered to be a public-private partnership where we team up with a tax credit investor who then receives federal tax credits because of their investment into an affordable housing project. And then we also use CDBG funds, home funds, special purpose grants. We also use our own equity sometimes from the sale of other units or repositioning assets, and I'll talk more in detail. But that gap funding is very limited. It is also very competitive, and it is absolutely impossible to deliver affordable housing without gap funding.
Kristen, if I could just maybe interrupt for just a second before you move on, can you give the audience just a better flavor for how much gap does a project typically need in terms of your total budget?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I have a pie chart.
Excellent.
I think it's in a couple slides, so we'll get there. And if that still doesn't answer the question, let me know, Joe, but we try to break it down by percentage to really tell that story. A tool that we have liked to share with folks is produced by the Urban Institute in partnership with the National Housing Conference. And this is a link, and we're happy to send it out to the group. But it actually lets you build an affordable housing project and say, you know, okay, if you're charging 50% of AMI rent and you paid X for land, and this sliding scale sort of shows you how much gap you have depending on the type of project that you do. We have shared this with our board of commissioners and a lot of folks who have found it very helpful to kind of see for themselves how you put together and finance an affordable housing project. And again, we'll send this link out. This is a snapshot from the website, but it can be kind of interesting to see how you really put together these deals and how challenging it is to really fill that gap. So the resources that we utilize for affordable housing development include, as I mentioned, Low Income Housing Tax Credit. It's known as LIHTC. That is administered by the Colorado Housing and Finance Authority. There is only a certain amount of tax credit available at the state level, and so it is competitive. We also utilize tax-exempt private activity bond, known as PAB. The city of Fort Collins in Larimer County has some amount of private activity bond available locally. We are required to use these bonds anytime you are using the 4% tax credit program. I'll talk more about that. But we're very limited in the state by private activity bonds. The amount that we have locally would only deliver us, 60 to 80 units per year. As you know from our pipeline and the need, we need a lot more than that. We also utilize CDBG and home funds. Those are that is federal money that is administered by the city of Fort Collins through a competitive process. Again, these are competitive funds that are limited annually. And then there's other gap funding that can look different in different deals. That might be a contribution of land or a capital influx from all sorts of different sources. What I want to point out about these sources, as I mentioned, they're absolutely necessary to deliver affordable units. They are competitive, they are limited, and they are currently being maximized in our community. So the idea that when we have policy that, encourages additional affordable housing, if we don't also have additional resources, we are going to be capped by the amount of resources that are available both locally and at the state level. So what we like to say is that although there are plans for additional projects in the pipelines and some really great ideas out there, unless we have some more of these resources available or strategize, we are not delivering net new units to the community. The amount of resources that are available can only deliver a certain amount of units every year, and we are maximizing them, us and our partners currently, to delivering the most amount of housing that really can be. So the pie chart. This is an example of a project. They all look slightly different, but it's a fairly good example. And I should say there is no more deals out there in affordable housing development that are what we call vanilla, that just have tax credit, debt, and we go on our way. They all have to really, put together a whole pot of different funding sources in order to make them work. And this one is fairly typical. So the big piece you see, the 46%, that is the tax credit equity. So as we say, when we can't do these deals without the use of tax credits, that's why nearly 50% of the project is funded by that really critical tax credit equity. And then you see about 27% of the project funded by debt, the lender. So this is what is very different from a market rate project versus an affordable housing project. That 27%, that is all an affordable housing project can afford to pay. So once we, build the project and convert to a permanent loan, our debt payments are sized based on what the income can afford, and it's usually around 20 to 30% of the project. That would look very different in a market rate project. The debt on a market rate project is usually, well above 50%. That when you only can fund about 27% of your project with debt, then you have a lot of gap that you need to fill. So in this project, we took advantage of special money that was kind of one-time money that was available at the time. It was known as CDBG disaster recovery money that we were able to use just specifically in Larimer County. That funded 7% of the project. Again, that's a pretty big chunk that would be hard to cover otherwise. We, as the owner, put in sale proceeds from the repositioning of public housing that we went through at Housing Catalyst. That was 11% of the project. So that's our own funds being granted to the project. It was known as the general partner loan because Housing Catalyst is the general partner in a tax credit project. And although we loan it into the project, we do not get that money back. We also received a home award, which is federal money administered by the city, also competitive, and that pays for 4% of the project. The fee waivers that are available in the city, which are currently just eligible for 30% AMI units and below, that is about 1% of the project costs. And then we also defer our own developer fee so that we don't get that developer fee paid up front. Instead, we sort of get it over time and loan it into the project. That's about 3% of the project cost. So as you can see, all sorts of funding sources are necessary. Not, if you increased one of them, maybe another funding source might not be necessary, but across the board, there is a large amount of gap funding and all sorts of funding sources that are really necessary to be able to put together any affordable housing tax credit project. So
Kristen, if I could, there's a,
yeah.
if I may just interrupt again, there's a question that came up that is this representative of a specific project, or does this look like what most of your projects are structured?
Yes and yes. This is actually our Village on Horsetooth project, so it is a specific project. And we chose this as an example because it's fairly typical, just in terms of the number of funding sources and the percentage breakdown. It is fairly typical. As I said, all deals look different, but in terms of the tax credit, equity, and the debt amount, this is fairly typical of an affordable housing project.
Great. And there was a second question that came in that, and again, fairly new program, but Prop 123, a lot has been said about that. And so I don't know if you're going to be talking about that specifically as we move on, but.
Yes, so Prop 123 would sort of fall into that special money category, and Housing Catalyst was successful in obtaining a Prop 123 funding award in the first round of application. And those funds were specifically for land banking. So we were able to find a piece of land and use that funding that will essentially cover 100% of the land cost. And that's actually a good segue because I wanted to talk about Oak 140 specifically as an example, so which relates to how we use Prop 123 money as well. So I think a lot of people are familiar with our Oak 140 project that was built in downtown Fort Collins. And this was a project where the land was contributed by the Downtown Development Authority. And in addition to the land contribution, the DDA also contributed a substantial amount of equity, over $5 million, to the project. Even with the land contribution and the equity contribution, we still needed to utilize competitive tax credits. And this project serves 30 to 80% AMI. So we were able to do what's called an income average project. So it averages at 60% of area median income. The funding sources that we were able to kind of skip in this project included that CDBG and home funding. So basically, kind of the point of this story is, even with land and equity, we still need gap funding and resources to be able to do these projects. And so that's going to be true about our Prop 123 project as well. That's in the pipeline. So that money covered the land acquisition, and we will still need to pursue grant funding and tax credits to be able to develop. However, it was very opportunistic. We would not have been able to acquire that land without the Prop 123 money and add that to our pipeline and get it developed within the next couple of years. There is also Prop 123 money that's available that can add equity to a tax credit project. And so that will be helpful, certainly helpful as well. And I think will actually increase the number of units that we are able to develop in the state by some amount. So another way besides development that we are able to kind of increase the supply and serve households in the community is through our voucher program. So I'll have Michelle talk about our vouchers.
Yeah, so as Kristen mentioned, the voucher program is the federal government's way to provide that really deep subsidy, and it primarily targets people with disabilities, elderly, and very, very low income families. We have roughly 1,600 vouchers that we administer throughout Fort Collins and Larimer County. And this pie chart just shows some of the different types of vouchers. So we have what are called regular vouchers that can serve any of those populations I just mentioned. But then there's also a number of special purpose vouchers, and those are targeted for very specific populations. For example, we have our Veteran Affairs Supportive Housing, which is strictly for veterans. The Family Unification Program, which targets, excuse me, families involved with child welfare system, and Foster Youth to Independence is targeting youth coming out of the foster care system. So what we've seen, I would say in the past 10 years or so, is any new vouchers tends to be targeted to a specific population. Excuse me. So we call those special purpose vouchers. The idea behind the voucher is that the voucher holder pays 30% of their gross income towards the rent, and Housing Catalyst pays the balance of the rent directly to the landlord or property manager. Sorry, that would get happen right when I'm ready to talk. So I think I'm happy to answer questions. I think primarily you were interested in more of the development aspect that Kristen presented, but we also wanted to make sure that you knew this is another way that we are making housing affordable for residents in the city and county. I would say we are also very aggressive anytime there is new funds to be had in the voucher program. We are applying for those and trying to bring those into our community.
Thanks, Michelle.
Mm-hmm.
So we are just about at the end of our slides. A couple things that I wanted to add just in terms of development and the Housing Catalyst perspective. I think as you can see from the images and from you all being familiar with the type of development we do, affordable housing we are committed to making beautiful places that are healthy for our residents to live. That does not necessarily mean it's more expensive to build. I think we have really worked over the years to make sure that we are developing projects that, are a place that our residents can respect themselves, and as well as a place that the greater community can look at and be proud of. That is important to us, and it is important to our residents. I do think sometimes there's a misconception that, couldn't we have more housing if we just made it less nice? And I think that delivering beautiful housing doesn't necessarily mean that it is more expensive. We work with a lot of really talented designers and builders that know our values focused on health, safety, sustainability, well-being, and have really been able to do that in a way that is maximizing all of the resources, because at the end of the day, we do want to be serving the most amount of households that we can. And I think that's the end of our slides.
We've got a couple of questions. Okay. I'm going to open it up. Mark of Larimer County, do you have a question relative to how easy it is to access vouchers for folks with special needs? Do you want to unmute and?
Yes. Thank you so much. My name is Anais, and I'm an advocate with the ARC, and a large part of what we're tasked with is supporting clients with IDD locally who struggle to get affordable housing and get that supportive housing, right? So with an IDD, you need that ongoing support and systems in place to allow clients to stay housed. And so are there any discussions at Housing Catalyst to pursue those specific vouchers that can provide permanent supportive housing for clients with disabilities, and what could that look like?
Yes, we have about 256 vouchers that are specifically for people who are non-elderly and disabled. And those are not our restrictions or our preferences. Those are coming directly from HUD. And unfortunately, we, again, don't have the resources that it takes to house the need out there. And so those vouchers are oftentimes paired with services with service providers such as yourself. The way you can access those vouchers, we open a wait list once every 1 to 2 years. We leave it open for a couple weeks so that people can apply online. And then we close it, we run a lottery, and we select about the number of households we feel like we can serve in a 1 to 2 year period. And then those folks are placed on a wait list. And it's not a great system, but that's the system we have to work within at this point. Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much. Just a quick follow-up. Can you remind me again what that number is that HUD outlines that you guys can disperse?
Right now, total, we have about 1,600 vouchers. And of those, I think we have roughly, I'm trying to think, we have so many different types, but there are 256, I know, that are dedicated to people with disabilities. People with disabilities can also, of course, access regular vouchers, project-based vouchers. The total is more, but those are just the ones that have that as a requirement for those vouchers.
Beautiful. And then finally, what can we do as an advocacy agency to support you guys as well in having more access to that? Is there anything that we as agencies that advocate around this can do to support that increase?
The increase is really based on congressional allocations. That's what determines how many vouchers we get and how many we can issue in the community. So I think advocating on local, state, and national levels for more funding for the voucher program is the best way that you can help us support those folks.
Thank you so much.
Trish Werner has a question relative to what is the current wait list for vouchers?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, we try and only put the number of folks that we can serve in a 1 to 2 year period on the wait list. So the wait list does not really reflect the need. And that time that people spend on the wait list also varies by bedroom size. So for example, if you are waiting for a 1-bedroom voucher, it's going to be a much longer wait because we have fewer 1-bedrooms in the community. Our fastest moving wait list would be for a 2-bedroom. And that's determined by your family size and composition. I would say 2-bedroom, our wait right now is probably about 2 years.
Great, thank you. Trish, did you have a follow-up on that one?
No, thank you. The response and the question before that addressed some of the things I was curious about, so thank you.
Great, thank you. So if I may, Kristen and Michelle, can you talk a little bit about what the qualification process looks like, both for the just regular tax credit unit as well as for these vouchers?
Michelle, do you want to talk about vouchers first? And then
Sure.
I'll chime in
Sure.
about tax credit.
Yeah, to qualify for a voucher, your income has to be below 50% of area median income. We also there's a criminal background check that's done, but really there's no prohibition against, having a felony or things like that. The only 2 populations that HUD says we cannot serve with the voucher is a lifetime registered sex offender and someone convicted of producing methamphetamines. So those are what HUD says, no, you absolutely cannot. Other than that, we really looked at each application individually. I think there's a myth out there that if you have a criminal background, you're not eligible, and that is simply not true. We looked at each case individually and always try to get to yes. And
yeah, so in terms of the tax credit program, there are a variety of screening and qualification process. So what we're looking for, and it depends, so our different properties have different income levels. The tax credit program used to be limited to serving people between 30 and 60% of area median income. And in recent years, CHFA has passed the income average program that allows us to serve people up to 80% in a tax credit property, as long as the overall average of the property does not exceed 60% AMI. And the goal of this was really to increase those lower AMI units, and in return also be able to serve that 70 and 80% AMI that is also currently missing in the market. So that has been a really kind of exciting change. So in a single building, we can have units at all of the income levels from 30% up to 80% AMI, but we have to have a very specific number of units at all of those income levels so that we are in compliance with the tax credit program to not exceed the average of 60%. So we need to income qualify people, make sure that their income, if we have a 40% AMI unit that needs to be filled, we need to make sure that nobody earns any more than 40% of the area median income, but they also need to show that they earn enough to pay for the rent. So by documented income history. And then we do the typical landlord steps of credit check, background check, to make sure, that we are signing up a resident who can be successful in terms of entering into our lease agreement. So that's kind of a typical tax credit program. I will say permanent supportive housing is also a tax credit, and all of the units at our permanent supportive housing communities are restricted to 30% AMI, and all of them have vouchers because those are units designed for people who are transitioning out of homelessness.
And I have the chart pulled up just to give you some idea of what those income, because the next question is always, well, how much is 50%
Okay.
So just to give you some idea, one person household, so it's based on your household size basically, but a one person household at 30% of area median income could earn up to $22,550. On the other end of the spectrum, one person at 80% of area median income can earn $60,100.
Thank you. So
And the
just
rent
real quick,
is dictated by that income level. So someone at 80% AMI is paying more rent.
and if you could maybe just put a bow on that piece about compliance. So what happens when a resident, their income goes up, and what happens then? Do they get booted out?
They do not. So residents are required to income qualify when they initially lease up. But once qualified, they're always qualified. So what typically actually happens if someone, say, goes from $60,000 income to $100,000 income, is they're probably going to move on into something bigger, something nicer, purchase a home, but there's no requirement that they leave. And honestly, we have very few people that situation would apply to.
But it is sort of a difference in the tax credit program versus more of the old school federal programs that once qualified, always qualified. So you're not really discouraging. The program is designed so that you're not discouraging people to increase their income.
The voucher program is different. So in the voucher program, if their income goes over 50% of area median income, then they would lose their assistance. Because at that point, they should be able to, go into a tax credit unit on their own.
Yeah.
Great. So we've got another question that came in from Kit Brown. Kit, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. No, appreciate it, Joe. And Kristen, thank you for your perspective here. And I had a question. We're seeing a lot of cost increases, especially throughout COVID, with supply chain challenges, different electrical gear, really just costs going up across the board, and kind of limits, I would imagine, limits your ability to add new units to the market. But just wanted to see if you had perspective on that, see if there's some cost per unit increases that you've seen on that. And, you know, if you could just kind of shed some perspective on the challenges you've seen there, would appreciate that.
Yes, absolutely. The cost of construction as well as interest rates have have driven up the cost to deliver affordable housing. So the cost per unit has increased substantially. The subsidy and resources and gap filler available per unit has not nearly kept up with that. So the result of that has been a decrease in number of units because we are still trying to, you know, deliver projects, but when your cost per unit has gone up so much, what we're seeing is the number of units included in each tax credit project has gone down. It used to be the average of number of units of projects that were awarded tax credits were in that kind of 80 to 100 range or more. And that has really started to shrink because the resources, you know, like I said, the resources have not kept up with the rate of cost increase, especially the cost of construction and the interest rate market. You know, the average cost per unit, according to CHFA, the Colorado Housing Finance Authority, of people delivering affordable housing units in Colorado is over $500,000 per unit currently. We've seen deals more than that. You sometimes see deals less than that, but that is the reality. And it affects us just the same as it has affected the market rate world.
Great. So let me just do, again, circling back on the point that you made earlier, that we have a lot of communities in the region that have objectives and goals that say we want X% of our total housing inventory to be quote unquote affordable. So we've got the kind of a political objective to make sure there's housing affordability, but as you pointed out, it requires a great deal of subsidy. So can you, and that may or may not be available to actually meet that objective. We've seen in other communities in the region where, again, they have inclusionary zoning requirements that actually state that X% of your project must deliver or pay for X number of units that meet their income thresholds. So can you talk a little bit about, you know, how those types of projects can or cannot actually perform in the absence of dedication of tax credits or some other pot of money?
Yeah, good question. So it reminds me to touch on a few other topics too, Joe. So I think a few things, right? And my perspective is that we need to be tackling this from all sides. It's not just about increasing subsidy and resources that are available. We also need to do the work to try and bring down the cost to deliver and construct affordable housing. So those are things that are related to incentives and development standards in the land use code. So we can start to bring down the cost per unit on the front end. That is part of the equation as well. Because you've seen that we are so constrained by the amount of competitive resources that are available, there are some other options out there, which include if folks are not able to tap into the tax credit program, what we have seen be successful is that targeting that 80 to 100% of AMI, you're not eligible for the tax credit program, but those are still necessary units in our community. And as we see over time, the need for that is just continuing to grow. Those projects can, let's say, afford more debt because they're charging more rent. They can kind of structure a deal differently than a tax credit deal and use some of those limited resources that are available, but not nearly as much. And they can look to the local housing authority as a partner, because that, in our perspective, also is getting towards the mission, right? Those are needed affordable units in our community. So kind of, I think the thinking on restricting all benefits and incentives to 60% AMI probably needs to evolve. Being able to have some benefits that are also eligible to 80 to 120% of AMI, even in the rental market, is probably a direction that we need to start looking at, because those deals can happen without dependency on competitive, limited resources. I also think there's, opportunity out there for, partnership in all different stages. I think the perspective that more developers or more land is going to create units, the reality is those won't be net new units, right? We're constrained by the amount of resources that are out there. It's just going to be a matter of timing of when these units can get built. And then as it relates to inclusionary zoning, I think there's so many different examples of how that has worked out there. Market rate it's very hard to deliver deed restricted, both rental or ownership units. It's, the compliance, there's just a lot of challenges with that. So a lot of times what you see with inclusionary zoning ordinances is the option to pay an in lieu fee is what a lot of market rate developers will choose when that requirement exists. And thereby you're requiring a new additional resource that can then be used for affordable housing. Whether or not that then has an impact on the market rate market and is driving up prices is, of course, the question and perspective that challenges inclusionary zoning. But I think, looking at all those things, and the impacts are very different in different communities, right? We look to Boulder that has an inclusionary zoning ordinance and seen what has happened, but what has driven costs up there might be different than what the impacts might be in Fort Collins, or let's say in the resort communities that have incredibly high prices and also a much higher construction cost than we do in the Front Range. So I think every solution needs to be really community specific, because what will happen in Fort Collins is not necessarily true in a resort community or in Denver or in Boulder.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So let's talk a little bit about that process. So of acquiring the tax credits, which of course again carry a lot of the water for these types of projects. So you mentioned that it's a very competitive process, and I think most of the folks on the call probably recognize that CHFA accepts applications twice a year for 2 different programs. And so again, it's kind of a beauty contest. But once you win the beauty contest, the work is only just beginning, right? So could you talk through a little bit of what that process looks like once you get an award?
Sure. So competitive tax credits, as you mentioned, there's a 9% tax credit and a 4% state tax credit. Those are a little bit different in application and kind of target population typically. Each round these days is overprescribed about 3-1. So about a third of the projects that submit in any round get funded. They're highly competitive. So once a tax credit award is given, you need to basically select an investor. So you're looking for someone and these are folks, this is not just someone who might have an interest in affordable housing that has some money in the bank. These are big companies that typically have very large federal tax liability. So examples in Colorado, JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, US Bank. These are the types of folks that are typical tax credit investors. And so you need to kind of figure out which one can offer you the best terms at that time. And then there's a very complicated partnership agreement that is entered into that you are negotiating through the life of the partnership, which in the tax credit world is 15 years. So you're trying to play out every worst case scenario that could possibly happen over the course of those 15 years. But what the investors want to know is that, does the developer, one, know how to build the building, know how to manage it, make sure that it will be in compliance. If let's say a resident moved in and was not properly income qualified, the tax credit for that unit goes away for the life of the project. There is extreme risk in the lease up and verification process, which is why having experience on all sides is completely necessary. And then that investor is able to take the tax credits over the course of the partnership over 15 years. They also are able to claim the depreciation of the asset, which can be very valuable to them as well. And then at the end of 15 years, there's an exit strategy that is negotiated. This does not mean that the project then flips to market. The land use restrictions are in place now for a minimum of 50 to 60 years, and we're even seeing longer restrictions. But so the partnership might dissolve, but the restrictions on affordability of the property remain in place. And then, depending on what is negotiated, the partner, which, in our tax credit deals, Housing Catalyst is the general partner, we retain ownership of that property. And then when it needs to be renovated and sort of, needs another infusion of capital, we've been putting away reserves over the course of the project. We then refinance it, renovate it, and kind of reset the clock with a new investor and, start the process again.
Great, thank you. So Brecken Schaefer, you have a great question. I'm going to let you ask it. So if you would unmute and fire away.
Thank you. I was wondering, just despite some of those community-specific challenges, what, in your opinion, can municipalities do to better support affordable development and make entitlements an easier process? I'm on the market rate side of this, so I have some of my own opinions as well, but I'm just wondering how you think that communities can better support entitlements. I know timing is important to get to ground and to handle that capital stack, so just curious on your thoughts.
Yeah, I don't know that the perspective of an affordable developer is all that different from market rate when it comes to what we want is predictability and minimizing risk. For us to be, because we have to put a lot of resources at risk before we are awarded tax credit, we really want to know that we can get a project approved. Our risk profile is certainly different than a market rate developer. And what the funders, and especially CHFA, wants to see is that if they award a project tax credits, it is definitely going to move forward. That means no risk of entitlements still exists. There have been projects, especially in really hard entitlement places like Boulder. There have been instances where a project has been awarded tax credits and then got completely tied up in entitlements, and the project got appealed and it wasn't ever allowed to move forward. And that is very frustrating to CHFA. So now they really want to see projects that, there's no more risk. That means you've taken it through all of the development review process, the appeal process is over. And as you know, that means you have sunk a lot of resources into a deal to get it fully approved. That means you've put a lot of money out the door. So our recommendation is always that you're sort of making that process as quick and seamless as possible, that there's predictability in it. The recent changes to the land use code that had changed the level of review for affordable housing, that is a big deal to us. Being able to kind of get through that process quicker and minimizing risk, it's especially good for us because we are committed to public outreach and to listening to neighbors and kind of making sure that we go through that process. In no way are we trying to sidestep that. That's not why a faster process is better for us. It's just a matter of getting it approved in the quicker and most efficient manner is very helpful in terms of our risk and being able to get funded. The other thing is, it's just not a good business model to have a tax credit application that doesn't get approved for 3 years. There's so much cost and risk associated. So our strategy is always when we apply for tax credits, we want the most competitive application possible so that we are really confident that we are going to get an award. And the way you do that is having a project that is fully designed, entitled, and has very minimal risk to be able to move forward.
Which means you're spending a lot of money up front.
That's right. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's
Yeah.
millions of dollars. So do you
Yeah.
guys typically have land that's already been purchased then to have a more competitive application? And then a secondary question is, are there certain municipalities that you guys have been focusing on developing in just based upon the predictability of their entitlement process?
So CHFA requires site control to submit a tax credit application. That can mean that you have land under contract. It can mean that you have land acquired. If you're able to negotiate a contract where you can sit and wait for a tax credit award, that is ideal. Sometimes that's not possible and you have to take the risk. But you do have to have full control, site control of the site to be able to apply. So that is certainly a risk. Since we're the Fort Collins Housing Authority, we are focused on Fort Collins and Larimer County. We also can work in Larimer County. We also manage the Wellington Housing Authority, so we can work up there. I will say, other developers that have the ability to work in multiple jurisdictions absolutely look at the risk of entitlement as to whether to move forward a project. So if there's a developer looking at land in Boulder versus looking at land in Fort Collins, I'd venture to say Fort Collins is a easier landscape as it relates to entitlement, but Fort Collins might be a more challenging landscape related to some other municipalities. And that is absolutely taken into account especially by affordable housing developers.
So just speaking for Larimer County,
Mhm.
I know Loveland's very different, Fort Collins is very different. Estes Park is having a huge push for affordable housing units right now. Are there certain places that you guys do focus just within that Larimer County constraint?
Yeah, so we are in close communication, and the Loveland Housing Authority, Estes Park Housing Authority, and us, we really try to work together to kind of make sure that the resources are getting maximized and deployed in Larimer County and around northern Colorado. We each have our own challenges in our community, but we try to kind of support one another and manage our pipeline strategically. And that is partially because there is benefit to having the housing authority specifically as the developer, right? We are a nonprofit mission-driven developer, and every developer fee and any of the resources that come to Housing Catalyst get deployed back into the local community. That is different from an out-of-state developer or a for-profit developer that then takes their developer fee and goes back to their state or their community to invest. So we do think that deploying resources to local housing authorities specifically is really maximizing the resources in the community.
I think maybe more directly to your question, both Loveland Housing Authority and Estes Park Housing Authority are also doing developments. And so our projects tend to focus more in Fort Collins.
Thank you all for your time today.
So I'll just add one other piece. I think Kristen is downplaying it just a little bit. I would say that it's more difficult to get a quote unquote affordable housing project approved than it is a market rate, because market rate doesn't carry the neighborhood stigma. As folks that will claim to be very supportive of affordable housing, but are quick to point out that it doesn't belong here. So I would say that you actually deal with more pushback from the community than the market rate developer, which adds, again, more risk to your project. Okay, so let's just, again, slightly switching gears. But you talked a little bit about how you negotiate the tax credits with your investors, and they do want a great deal of certainty as that project's going to be delivered. Talk a little bit about what Prop 123 means, because it's more than just a source of funding for you. So can you talk about what that's doing to help, or perhaps too early to tell whether it's helping or not, push communities towards a more fast track type of approval process?
Yes, I'm dangerously familiar. So the the way Prop 123 works, in order to be able to access those funds, your local jurisdiction has to have opted in to Prop 123, which has specific requirements. And one of those is that you are able to review and approve a project within a certain expedited timeline for affordable housing. Otherwise, your jurisdiction is not eligible for projects or developers to receive Prop 123 funding. They also have to be, they also need to be committed to producing a certain number of affordable housing units within local policy. So kind of the idea that, okay, there's all this, there are funds available, and we'll make those available to projects, but your local jurisdiction needs to be committed to this effort as well. And City of Fort Collins has opted in, and the processes that they have updated and put into place have been approved to make our community eligible for that money. And if someone else has a better understanding or way of explaining that, please.
Well, I think, where I was going to try to get to with this is that, again, Prop 123 requires the local community to develop that fast review turnaround process, but it also requires that you're committing to increasing your inventory of affordable. And again, maybe it's too soon to know, but if you've done any preliminary analysis to determine if you have to increase your inventory by 3%, and I'm sure there's folks on the call here who can confirm this, but if you're having to increase your inventory by 3% over a period of time, are there even sufficient resources for communities to do that?
That is the big question. Like we said, having policy that supports housing does not produce necessarily more housing if you're limited by the resources. And we don't think that we can like subsidize our way out of this issue. We need to tackle it on all sides, right? Reducing the costs to build it, adding additional resources, finding different ways to deliver units at different levels. All of those things need to be necessary. Incentives, fee waivers, credits, all of those things are real, can help move the needle one way or another, but we can't do just one of those things. We need to be doing all of those things, because just policy alone it's hard to say that will just produce more units.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's something that we'll have to kind of keep our eyes on, because I think more and more communities are going to realize at some point that idea was great, and maybe this is the limitation of taking these sorts of things to the voters because they don't necessarily understand all the implications that are included. But sometimes that's the only way you can move policy forward. So again, I think it's just something for folks to keep in mind that 123 is great. It's not a solution, and may in fact actually create some contradictions within itself in order to be eligible. So just again, keep it in mind for those of you who are on the policy side.
I also think I'll just say it can start the right conversation, right? We're moving in a direction now that we're, having policy to support the housing. We're realizing that makes people realize, oh, we need more resources. And I think it starts us moving in an important direction.
Great. Thank you for that. All right. So I don't want to hog the mic here. If there are other folks that have questions that burning in the back of your mind as to how we've got some great expertise on the call here. So I want to take full advantage of that. While folks are maybe thinking of what their next question is, if you could maybe just talk a little bit about what your experience has been in terms of the size of projects. You touched on this earlier, that it used to be that you could do these larger projects like you did on Shield Street, where that was an acquisition, 200 and some units, almost 300 units, right? Are there other ways that we can do large projects and still meet some of that affordability without necessarily relying on subsidy? And how big do those projects need to be?
Good question. I mean, on the true tax credit deals, there's just new calculations with the equity that gets capped out. And when you start getting over 80 units, it doesn't make sense to pencil out anymore. So for ground up development, those large scale projects at all affordable are really hard to do. What you'll see is people, maybe for-profit developers might partner with a housing authority or a nonprofit to deliver a mix of market rate and affordable in the same project, and just those affordable units utilize the tax credit, and that's kind of how you would get more just units. But otherwise, the larger scale projects, I mean, the amount of resources available is just, when we're limited to, certainly less than 100 units per year locally in the amount of resources, especially for units at 60% AMI and below. I think the trick is going to have to be that those AMI, that you can start to go above that so that you're not restricted. That's the only way you're going to get large scale projects done, because you can't do that being dependent on gap filler and tax credit resources. Would be to have kind of those 80 to 120% of AMI units. Even then, they're hard to pencil out.
Yeah, and with a lot of discussion about workforce housing, and again, personal preference, I hate the term, but we talk about that, trying to serve that 80 to 120 that you referenced earlier, and there really are no resources that are necessarily dedicated to that, but that seems to be kind of the emphasis on a policy side that we need to start addressing. So again, I think it just helps folks to understand that what we want is not necessarily what we can deliver unless we change the rules for how we either allocate funds or how we affect the cost of housing beyond just the sticks and bricks.
Yes, we are seeing some new tools come out at the state level, like pilot programs for the Middle Income Housing Authority that does allow you to serve those 80 to 100% AMI. So hopefully those are successful and we'll see those types of programs expanded. But right now, being pilot programs, they're very small amount of resources that are available.
Yeah, and thanks for touching on that real quick. So the Middle Income Housing Authority, for those of you who aren't familiar, the legislature introduced that, I think it was 2 years ago, created this Middle Income Housing Authority, which effectively is CHFA. It's a subsidiary or a portion of CHFA. And what exactly does that bring to the table? Because on the surface, it seems like it's really just a way to abate property taxes for qualified projects. But are there other benefits to the creation of that housing authority, that Middle Income Housing Authority?
I think people are still trying to figure that out, and I don't know, because it wouldn't make sense for us, right? We are a housing authority and we have tax exemption benefit. But for somebody who, if you are able to utilize tax exemption on 80 to 100% by utilizing the Middle Income Housing Authority, known as MIHA, that could be really beneficial. Whether or not there's other tools and resources available through that, I think people are still trying to sort through that.
Great. I'm going to throw it back to Brecken. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Hi, thank you again. I apologize for all the questions here, but I'm just curious for policymakers and kind of in light of the Fort Collins Land Use Code updates, and just speaking of Prop 123, what examples or ideas do you have of successful policies or processes that could aid in predictability and timely entitlements at the municipality level? Like what would be helpful for you going through this process with cities to ensure that we're having affordable housing delivered at a much more timely level?
Yeah, honestly, I think the provisions that were included in the recent code update are real improvements, right? certainly being able to be on a fast track where you are guaranteed a certain number of days of review at all of the different levels is very helpful. And then just bringing down the level of review from planning and zoning board to a basic development review, those are improvements, and those are going to be a big impact. So I think the city of Fort Collins absolutely got all of that right and was maintaining that in the code, are big steps to that improvement. In terms of other things that might be in there, I'm not sure. I don't think we're a community that will ever be able to take away discretionary review for affordable housing or any other projects. That's just not who we are as a community. So I think they have done all the things that can be done in terms of improving that process. I should say the other incentives that are in the code will also make an impact. So the parking reduction, the height bonus, the setbacks, the density increases, all of those things will absolutely help bring down the cost and can help make projects pencil out on a specific site.
Did you have a follow-up on that, Brecken?
No, that's it. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, yeah, so Kristen, talk about the parking for just a second, if you would. So obviously, for every parking space, well, I think it used to be anyways, that you could build another unit for every 2 or 3 parking spaces.
Yeah, that's not quite true, but it's a big cost.
Yeah, so it obviously the cost associated, especially as you talk about more infill development where your parking is structured as opposed to just a big asphalt field, right? So there's a real fine line between providing enough parking for your residents, so residents and their visitors, but you don't want to, I guess, sacrifice additional dwelling units in order to meet parking requirements. So can you talk a little bit about what you've found from your experience, and certainly through your projects and others that you're familiar with? What is that healthy balance? Again, it's also driven by the income that you're serving, right? But talk a little bit about what that healthy balance looks like.
Sure. So I will say it varies for us between suburban context and more urban infill, right? Our suburban context projects have bigger unit sizes, and under the land use code, that really drives up the parking requirements because we calculate parking per bedroom. So when we have a lot of 2 and 3 bedroom units, the parking requirements get to be really big and much more than we would need to best serve our households. And we certainly see people at 30 and 40% AMI have lower vehicle ownership rates. So we have traditionally pursued and received about a 15% reduction from the code parking standards. Again, that's under the old existing code for our suburban context projects. And that we find to still be slightly overparked still. So I think for us, and we can demonstrate that, and it wasn't very controversial for us to receive those modifications through the process. We'll say location is also important. Even our suburban context projects still have access to bus service, schools, grocery stores. So it is certainly possible for people to be living without a vehicle. But then when we look at downtown, when it is absolutely possible to be living without a car in the heart of downtown Fort Collins, those parking standards are much lower. And so our Oak 140 project, I think we have 50 parking spaces for the 79 units, and we have more than enough. So we certainly, what was in the old code was, in our opinion, very overparked as it relates to affordable housing. And, the cost of parking can range from, 10 to 20,000 per space up to 40,000 per space in structured parking. And so there's the cost of that. And there's also the actual physical constraints to figure out how to get the right amount of parking spaces into a site or into a building. So if you can bring that down, you can certainly make more projects pencil out.
So generally speaking, you're probably talking about half to 3/4 of a parking spot for each unit, or is there a
Well, it really
easier.
varies by bedroom size, right? So our downtown project has a lot of 1-bedroom units. And so you're sort of, that's a different calculation than when you get to 2 and 3-bedroom family size units, although we don't necessarily see the number of vehicles owned per household increase as the bedroom sizes increase as much as you would in a market rate development. So that's why those parking reductions in those big family units are absolutely appropriate as well.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Yeah.
Great. All right. So just looking around, I'm not seeing anybody's hands up or anything else in the chat. So I'm going to just maybe ask if you have, Kristen and Michelle, if you have some just final thoughts that you have to share. I mean, I should point out though that as a reminder, everyone is going to get a link to the tool that Kristen highlighted earlier in her presentation that allows those of you to play at home to figure out what you can build and how much subsidy you need. We'll also be forwarding out contact information. Kristen and Michelle were kind enough to allow us to lift the veil of secrecy and share their emails. So if you have follow-up questions that you want to ask, they've graciously allowed us to share their information. But I'll now just throw it back to you, Kristen, Michelle, if you have any final thoughts before I do my wrap-up.
I would just say, thank you for having us and raising this topic, and encourage everyone to have these same conversations in your circles with your neighbors at your work, so that people have a better understanding of what it takes to build affordable housing and can make really informed decisions on things like land use code changes.
Great.
Yeah. Thanks. I echo that. I really appreciate this conversation and this group. So thanks for inviting us, Joe, and for everyone's really great questions and for being here. I feel like sometimes I'm saying the same thing in a lot of different places, but I do think it's, this is really important to our community. And we are really happy and honored to be able to do the work here and generally feel very supported in what we do. And we really do appreciate that.
Great. Well, I think on behalf of the community, we really appreciate what you're doing. And I will say that for your counterparts across Northern Colorado. So as Kristen alluded to, there are housing authorities and developers that are working across Larimer, Well, Boulder County that, again, run into a lot of the same issues. And it's just helpful if local policymakers across the region start to, again, hear this from multiple folks about what some of these challenges are so that, again, we can collectively have a greater impact on the policy decisions that are being made. So with that, I will, again, just remind everybody that we do these webinars on a quarterly basis, and we do try to set aside one a year where we all get together in person, do more of a half-day kind of boot camp sort of thing with a couple of different topics on the menu. So just keep that in mind. You're going to get reminders of those as they become available. But for now, I'm going to just, again, share with you that you'll have a email in your email box next week that provides a link to this presentation and others. And then, again, thanking our sponsors that make all this possible. So EPS Group, Northern Engineering, Brownstein, Somerset, New Colony Apartments. Thank you for our sponsors. But most importantly, thank you for Kristen and Michelle taking your time and sharing your expertise to help elevate the conversation on housing. So with that, I will thank all of you for attending, and we'll look forward to seeing you at our next webinar.